The elevator didn't just stop, it seized. One moment, the smooth ascent of the high-speed car was a given, a background hum I barely registered. The next, a violent shudder threw me sideways, my heels skidding on the polished floor. The hum of the machinery died instantly, replaced by a ringing silence so absolute it felt heavy. I stumbled in the dark, bracing for an impact that never came because a hand caught my arm. Firm, warm. "Steady," a voice murmured, low and amused. The emergency lights flickered to life, bathing the steel box in amber. And there she was, Jax, looking at me with an unflinching gaze that told me the trouble was just starting. Before the world narrowed down to a 6x6 steel box, my life was a masterpiece of architectural precision. I operated within a grid of 15-minute increments, a schedule tight enough to strangle anyone who didn't thrive on pressure. I was the woman who anticipated the market shift before the ticker updated, the executive who wore structure like a second skin. My tailored blazer was armor. My silk blouse, buttoned to the throat, was a shield. I was reviewing the final clauses of a merger that would redefine the skyline, my mind a stream of figures and risk assessments. Control wasn't just a preference for me. It was a necessity. Then she walked in. It happened on the lobby floor. I was holding the door, checking my watch, calculating the exact seconds it would take to reach the 42nd floor. She slid through the closing gap with a grace that felt entirely accidental, yet perfectly timed. She was a riot of texture in a world of smooth surfaces. A distressed leather jacket that had seen more late nights than I had seen boardrooms. Headphones resting around her neck, bleeding the faint, tinny sound of a complex bass line into the sterile air. Her energy was static, a hum of chaos that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up before she even looked at me. She didn't press a button. She just leaned back against the rail, closed her eyes, and let out a breath that smelled of mint and something sharper, like clove. I shifted my weight, annoyance flaring hot in my chest. I wanted to ask if she had a destination, or if she was just riding the vertical currents for sport. But I stayed silent, adjusting my grip on my tablet, reinforcing the barrier between us. Then the grid failed. It wasn't a flicker. It was a hard cut. The building didn't just lose power. It felt like the heart of the city stopped beating. The darkness was instantaneous and total, a physical weight that pressed against my eyes. For a split second, the sensation of falling seized me, vertigo spinning the dark into a kaleidoscope of panic. The air conditioning died, and the sudden stillness was suffocating. In my world, silence is a pause before a negotiation tactic. Here, in the pitch black, silence was a predator. I froze. My training, my precision, my ability to forecast outcomes, none of it worked in a void. I was blind, stripped of the visual cues I rely on to dominate a room. I couldn't see the elevator panel. I couldn't see my own hands. All I had was the sudden, overwhelming awareness of her. The proximity shifted. In the light, she had been 5 feet away. In the dark, she felt inches from my skin. I could hear the shift of fabric, denim against leather, as she moved. I could hear the change in her breathing. Not a gasp of fear, but a deepening rhythm. "Well?" Her voice cut through the dark. It wasn't loud, but in the small, sealed acoustic chamber, it vibrated right through my chest. It was a low, textured sound, raspy at the edges. That's dramatic. I opened my mouth to respond, to assert some form of authority, to demand we check the emergency phone, but the sound died in my throat. Because she chuckled. It was a dark, bold sound, rippling with amusement rather than terror. Who laughs when they are suspended in a metal cage hundreds of feet above the ground? "Are you all right?" I managed to ask, my voice sounding thin, stripped of its usual boardroom resonance. "I'm fantastic," she replied, and I could practically hear the smirk in the darkness. "But you sound like you're gripping that railing hard enough to bend it." She was right. My knuckles were white. I knew it even if I couldn't see them. The loss of visual control forced my senses to compensate. The smell of her leather jacket intensified, mixing with the scent of ozone from the stalled machinery and the faint, expensive floral notes of my own perfume. It was a heady, disorienting mix. I was trying to map the space by sound alone, trying to locate exactly where she was standing, when the emergency system finally kicked in. The light didn't return fully. It buzzed into existence, a single flickering bulb caged in wire mesh. It cast long, jagged shadows against the brushed steel walls, turning the elevator into a space that felt less like an office transport and more like an interrogation room. The amber glow washed over her. She hadn't moved from the rail. She was watching me, her head tilted to the side, that chaos energy now focused entirely on me. The emergency lighting didn't restore order. It created a stage. In that flickering, amber-hued glow, the elevator felt less like a corporate transport cage and more like a private room carved out of the city's subconscious. Jax hadn't moved. She was leaning back against the brushed steel rail, ankles crossed, looking entirely, maddeningly too comfortable for a disaster scenario. Her eyes were dark, catching the erratic light, and they were fixed on me with an expression that was unsettlingly unflinching. There was no fear there, no frantic searching for an exit, just a low, simmering amusement, as if she were watching a play she'd already read the reviews for and knew exactly how the second act would unravel. I, on the other hand, was vibrating with the desperate need for action. My world is built on connectivity, on the relentless flow of information. I pulled my phone from my pocket, the motion sharp and practiced. The screen lit up, a useless beacon in the gloom. No service, the words mocked me. I tapped the screen repeatedly, as if force of will could summon a signal tower, but the bars remained grayed out. I shoved it back into my pocket and turned to the control panel, stabbing the emergency call button. Nothing. Not even the reassuring crackle of a line opening. Just dead, heavy silence. I hit the alarm button. A weak, strangled buzz echoed in the shaft, sounding pathetic rather than urgent. You know, Jax's voice drifted over, lazy and rich like smoke. You can bruise your manicured finger on that button, but I don't think the building is in the mood to listen. I spun around, my blazer whipping with the movement. We need to alert security. There are protocols for this. Protocols, she repeated, tasting the word like it was an exotic, tasteless fruit. She pushed off the rail, taking a single step toward me. The space, which had felt cramped before, suddenly felt microscopic. You're fascinating. You're standing in a metal box dangling in a blackout, and you're still trying to file a report. She gestured vaguely at my outfit, her eyes tracking the sharp lines of my lapels. That armor looks expensive, tailored, designed to intimidate across a mahogany table. But in here, in the dark, it's just wool and silk, darling. It won't save you from the weight. The word armor hit a raw nerve. She saw right through the construction. I stiffened, pulling my shoulders back, trying to reclaim the vertical height her presence seemed to steal. It's not armor. It's professional. It's necessary. It's a cage, she countered softly. She wasn't mocking me. Not exactly. It was more like she was inspecting a curious specimen. And you're wearing it tight. The air thickened instantly. It wasn't just the lack of ventilation, though the temperature was already beginning to creep up. It was the charge between us. The silence that followed her comment wasn't empty. It was heavy, filled with the static of two opposing forces trapped in a vacuum. I could feel her gaze on me, tactile and warm. It made the skin on my neck prickle. I tried to look away, to focus on the floor numbers above the door, but my senses were betraying me. In the absence of visual clarity, my nose became hyper-aware. The sterile, recycled air of the office building was gone. In its place was her. The scent of worn leather, warm and earthy. Underneath that, something sharper. Clove cigarettes, maybe? Or ozone? Or just the smell of rain on pavement. It was a gritty, real-world scent that clashed violently with the clean, powdery floral of my own perfume. It was the smell of the street, invading the sanctuary of the tower. We could be here for hours, I said, my voice tighter than I intended. I was stating a fact, trying to regain the high ground of logic. Maybe, she agreed, sliding her hands into her jacket pockets. She leaned back against the wall again, but her eyes never left mine. Or maybe just long enough for you to unzip that jacket and breathe. I stared at her. The audacity was breathtaking. But underneath the indignation, my heart hammered a rhythm that had nothing to do with fear. The elevator remained stubbornly motionless, a suspended reality where my rules didn't apply, and hers were just beginning to take hold. I realized then that I wasn't waiting for the lights to come back on. I was waiting to see what she would say next. 10 minutes stretched into 20, and the adrenaline that had initially kept me rigid began to curdle into a dull, throbbing ache centered entirely in the arches of my feet. My heels were Italian, beautiful, architectural marvels designed for boardrooms and the plush carpet of executive limousines, not for standing stationary on a steel plate for an indeterminate amount of time. I shifted my weight imperceptibly, or so I hoped, trying to alleviate the burning sensation in my calves without conceding weakness. But in this amber-lit confessional, nothing escaped her. Jax watched the micro-movement of my ankle with the focus of a cat tracking a laser pointer. She didn't say anything at first. She just pushed herself off the wall, stretched her arms over her head, a languid feline movement that exposed a sliver of pale skin between her gray t-shirt and the waistband of her jeans, and then slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor. She sprawled her legs out, crossing them at the ankles, looking up at me with a grin that was equal parts invitation and dare. "Floor's not heated," she drawled, patting the linoleum beside her with a rhythmic tap. "But it beats wobbling up there like a statue about to topple over." "I am not wobbling," I corrected, though my voice lacked its usual bite. "And I certainly am not sitting on the floor of a public elevator. It's unsanitary." "Suit yourself," she shrugged, pulling a pack of gum from her pocket and popping a piece in her mouth. "But if we're here for the long haul, you're going to break an ankle, or your pride. Might as well get the pride out of the way first. It heals faster." She was infuriating. She was also right. The burning in my legs was becoming a scream. I looked at her, sitting there in the flickering light, looking like the cover of an underground indie album, and then I looked at the floor. It was a surrender. I knew it, and she knew it. I exhaled, a sharp hiss of frustration, and unbuttoned my blazer to allow for movement. I lowered myself down, trying to maintain some semblance of dignity while maneuvering a pencil skirt that wasn't designed for anything lower than a mid-century modern chair. I settled against the wall opposite her, keeping my legs tucked to the side, maintaining a rigid posture even in defeat. The shift in perspective was jarring. Standing, I had the illusion of command. Sitting, we were on the same level. Actually, the intimacy of the space seemed to triple. The elevator felt smaller, the air denser. My knees were only inches from the worn toes of her combat boots. The physical distance I had carefully curated with my silence and my posture had evaporated. She chewed her gum thoughtfully, her eyes tracing the line of my jaw before dropping to the tablet I was still clutching like a lifeline. "So," she said, nodding at the device, "what's the big pitch? The one you were rehearsing in your head before the world ended?" I glanced at the black screen. "It's a merger acquisition strategy for a logistics conglomerate. We're restructuring their debt to maximize shareholder value prior to a hostile takeover defense." "Wow," she deadpanned. I fell asleep halfway through that sentence, and I'm the one trapped in a box. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, bridging the gap even further. Her voice dropped, losing the mocking edge and finding something raspier, more genuine. "I didn't ask what the file says. I asked what you were rehearsing. You had a look on your face when you walked in. Tight, scared, like you were trying to memorize a lot." Her observation felt like a physical touch, a finger pressed against a bruise. I wanted to deflect, to give her the corporate spiel about high stakes and pressure. But in the dim light, with the hum of the emergency bulb buzzing like a trapped fly, the rehearsed lines tasted like ash. "It's not a lie," I whispered, surprised by my own honesty. "It's just hollow. I've spent 6 months building this deal. It's brilliant. It's flawless. And I don't care about a single number on the page." Jax didn't laugh. She didn't tease. She just held my gaze, her expression unreadable, but intense. "Precision without passion," she murmured. "That's a dangerous way to live, Suit. You might just forget you're alive until the lights go out." The heat became a third passenger, distinct and oppressive. It wasn't a violent heat, not yet, but a creeping, suffocating warmth that pressed against my skin like a heavy palm, making the silk of my blouse cling uncomfortably to my lower back. I dabbed at my temple, mortified to find a sheen of dampness there. My internal thermostat, usually set to a cool, detached, professional 0, was spiking dangerously. I looked down at my blazer. The wool blend, an Italian fabric chosen specifically for its ability to project authority in a climate-controlled boardroom, was now a stifling blanket designed to suffocate me. I hesitated. Removing it felt like a concession I wasn't ready to make. It felt like stripping away the insignia of my rank, leaving me defenseless. But a bead of sweat traced a slow, ticklish line down my spine, a physical intrusion that broke my resolve. The physical discomfort finally overrode the psychological need for armor. I sat up straighter, exhaled a sharp, frustrated breath, and shrugged the jacket off. The movement was awkward in the confined space, my elbows brushing the cold metal walls as I wrestled my arms free. I folded the garment with precise, deliberate movements, old habits dying hard even in a crisis, and set it on my lap like a barrier. Underneath, I was wearing a sleeveless silk shell, cream-colored and dangerously thin. The sudden exposure of my arms to the stagnant air felt shocking, almost illicit. I was just a woman in a silk top, sitting on a dirty floor. The architecture of my power dissolved. "There she is," Jack said. Her voice had dropped an octave, losing the sharp edge of the T's and replacing it with something slower, thicker. It was a sultry, low rumble that seemed to vibrate along the floorboards and travel straight up my legs. She wasn't looking at my face. Her gaze was tracing the line of my bare arm, the curve of my shoulder, with an appreciation that was so open, so devoid of polite pretense, that it made my breath hitch in my throat. I was wondering if there was a person under all that wool. "It's getting warm," I deflected, my voice sounding breathy and foreign in the small space. I crossed my arms over my chest, a reflex to cover the vulnerability she was staring at, but the act only seemed to draw her eyes to the movement of my hands. "It is," she agreed, her eyes finally flicking up to meet mine. The amber light caught the flecks of gold in her irises, illuminating a spark of challenge. But I don't think it's just the ventilation failing. She let that hang there, dangerous and heavy, before shifting her weight. She pulled the headphones from around her neck, letting them rest on her thigh. They were large, professional grade, the leather on the ear cups worn soft from use. "You create chaos," I said, nodding at the headphones, desperate to shift the focus from the heat rising in my cheeks to something safe, something abstract. "That's what you bring into a room. Noise. Disruption." "Not noise," she corrected, her expression turning serious, almost reverent. She ran a thumb over the speaker mesh. "Rhythm. There's a difference. You think I just play songs? I don't. I build architecture, just like you. But mine is made of bass and frequency." She leaned forward, her elbows on her knees, her hands animating the space between us. "When I'm in the booth, I have 1,000 people on the floor. They think they're free, losing themselves. But they aren't. I'm controlling their heartbeat. I decide when they breathe. I decide when they scream. I can hold them in a breakdown, strip the track to silence until they're begging for it, absolutely desperate for the release. And then," she snapped her fingers, a sharp crack in the quiet elevator, "I give them the drop. I control the tension. You hold control tight, like you're strangling it. I manipulate it. I stretch it out until it snaps." I watched her, mesmerized. The way she spoke about control wasn't about spreadsheets or risk mitigation. It was visceral. It was about power over the body, over sensation. "And what happens when you lose control?" I asked softly. Jack smiled, a slow, predatory curve of her lips that made my stomach flip. "I never lose it, Suit. I just choose when to give it away." Her words hung in the stagnant air, vibrating with a truth I wasn't ready to acknowledge. I choose when to give it away. The concept was alien to me. In my life, control wasn't a currency you spent. It was the vault itself. But sitting there on the dusty linoleum, stripped of my blazer and my altitude, the vault felt increasingly like a prison cell. The silence that followed her statement wasn't empty. It was thick, pressurized by the heat and the sudden, terrifying intimacy of her philosophy. I needed to break the moment. I needed to shift the dynamic back to something manageable, something physical and mundane. My legs were screaming in protest, the circulation cut off by the awkward angle of my hips against the hard floor. I decided to adjust my position, to unfold my legs and perhaps stand up again to reclaim some vertical dignity. It was a simple, calculated movement. Shift weight to the left, extend the right leg, restore blood flow. But the building had other ideas. Just as I shifted my center of gravity, the elevator gave a sickening metallic groan. It wasn't a subtle sound. It was the screech of metal shearing against metal, a deep, resonant vibration that traveled up through the floorboards and rattled my teeth. Then, without warning, the car dropped. It was only an inch, maybe 2, a settling of the cables, a realignment of the brakes, but in the enclosed, suspended dark, it felt like the floor had simply ceased to exist. A gasp tore out of my throat, sharp and undignified. Instinct overrode protocol. My hands flew out, seeking purchase, seeking anything solid in a world that had suddenly become fluid. I didn't reach for the wall. I didn't reach for the rail. I reached for the only other living thing in the box. My right hand landed hard on her knee. The contact was instantaneous and jarring. It wasn't a polite brush. It was a desperate, gripping brace. My fingers curled into the fabric of her jeans, clutching the denim as if it were the edge of a cliff. The elevator shuddered once more, a final, settling thud, and then went still. But I didn't move. I couldn't. The shock of the drop faded instantly, replaced by a different kind of voltage. The heat of her skin seared through the worn denim, hotter than the air, hotter than the shame flushing my cheeks. It was a grounding current, solid and undeniable. Under my palm, her leg was firm, muscle tensed, but steady. I was acutely aware of the texture, the rough weave of the jeans, the hardness of her kneecap, the way my manicured nails dug into the fabric. I knew, logically, that the danger had passed. I knew the appropriate social response was to recoil, to mutter a breathless apology, to retreat to my corner of the steel box. Pull away, my brain commanded. Release the asset. Terminate the contact. But my hand didn't obey. It stayed there, anchored. For a heartbeat, 1, 2, 3 seconds, I allowed myself the luxury of holding on. It was a transgression. It was a breach of personal space that would have been unthinkable 20 minutes ago in the lobby. But here, in the amber twilight, the pull was magnetic. I could feel the hum of her energy, that chaotic static she carried, flowing directly into my palm. It was terrifying. It was intoxicating. Jax didn't flinch. She didn't jerk her leg away or make a joke about me falling for her. She went impossibly still. Slowly, with a deliberation that made my breath catch, she peeled her hand off the floor where she'd braced herself. She moved it through the heavy air, hovering over mine for a fraction of a second. A question, a warning, before lowering it down. She covered my hand with hers. The sensation was overwhelming. Her palm was warmer than mine, broader, the skin rougher. I could feel calluses on her fingertips, from the faders, from the vinyl, from living a life that wasn't wrapped in silk. She didn't just pat my hand, she engulfed it. Her fingers slid into the spaces between my knuckles, not intertwining, just pressing down, sealing my hand to her knee. It was a trap and a shelter all at once. The silence that stretched between us now was heavy, weighted with unsaid things. It wasn't the awkward silence of strangers anymore. It was the charged, dense silence of the precipice. I looked up, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Jax was watching me, her head tilted, her eyes dark pools in the shadows. She wasn't smiling. She looked serious, focused, like she was listening to a track and waiting for the beat to drop. She didn't let go. And God help me, neither did I. The silence that settled over us wasn't the vacuum of a stalled machine anymore. It was the heavy, pressurized quiet of a confessional booth, illuminated by a single, flickering amber bulb that buzzed like a dying insect against the wire mesh. In this dim, golden half-light, the usual social contracts dissolved. Here, with the heat rising and the air thick with the scent of her clove cigarettes and my own unraveling composure, there was only room for the truth. Jax didn't look away. Her gaze was a physical weight, heavier and far more stable than the hand she kept pressed firmly over mine. In the stark, unforgiving daylight of the lobby, I would have broken this contact instantly. I would have retreated behind a wall of icy professionalism, using my title and my posture to create a chasm between us. But here, in the suspended twilight, the rules of engagement had been rewritten. Her eyes were dark pools in the shadows, catching the erratic light, and they were fixed on me with an expression that was unsettlingly unflinching. It wasn't the predatory look I had expected, nor was it the mocking amusement from earlier. It was a steady, grounding recognition, as if she were reading a complex document and finally understanding the fine print. When she finally spoke, her voice was a murmur, pitched low enough to vibrate through the floorboards, traveling up through the point where our bodies connected. "I saw you," she said. Just 3 words, but they landed in the small space with the impact of a gavel. She shifted slightly, her thumb brushing the back of my hand in a slow, distracting rhythm that made it difficult to think in straight lines. "In the lobby. I wasn't waiting for the elevator. I was halfway to the exit. I had a gig in the Pearl District, a set I was already running late for. But then I saw you standing by the security desk, checking that watch like it was a bomb timer." She paused, her eyes searching mine, looking for the flinch I was trying desperately to suppress. "You looked severe," she continued, the word rolling off her tongue like a compliment. "Beautiful, absolutely, but terrifying, like you were holding the entire building up with your spine. And I thought, I have to know what happens if I stand next to that." The revelation shifted the ground beneath me more than the elevator drop had. This was calculation. She hadn't stumbled into my orbit. She had charted a course. There was a precision to her chaos that I hadn't anticipated, a deliberate targeting that made my pulse hammer a frantic, erratic rhythm against my throat. She wasn't just a passenger. She was an architect of this moment, just as much as I was a victim of it. "It wasn't chance," I whispered, the realization tasting strange and metallic. "It was precision." "I don't do random suit," she replied softly, her fingers tightening slightly over mine. "I mix. I match beats. I saw the frequency you were vibrating at, and I wanted to see if I could match it." The honesty demanded a return. I could feel the armor I had discarded, the blazer, the title, the persona, lying uselessly on the floor beside me. The darkness stripped away the polite lies we tell to keep society functioning, leaving only the raw data of attraction. "You weren't invisible," I admitted, the words slipping out before I could censor them. "I saw you come through the revolving doors. You were loud, visually loud. Everyone else in that lobby was gray and navy blue, merging into the architecture like background noise. You were a glitch in the matrix, a spike of static on a flat line. The leather, the walk, the way you didn't look at the security guard, you took up space you hadn't been assigned." I leaned in slightly, drawn by the gravity of her presence, my voice dropping to a hush. "I tried to file you away. I told myself you were just noise, irrelevant data. But when the doors started to close and I saw you running toward the bank, I didn't press the close door button. I could have. I usually do. It's a reflex. Efficiency above all else. But I didn't. I let the door stay open. I waited for the glitch." The teasing smirk that had played on her lips earlier had vanished completely, replaced by something rawer, something that looked dangerously like wonder. The vulnerability of being seen, truly seen, not as an executive or a DJ, but as 2 forces colliding, hung heavy in the air. We weren't just 2 strangers trapped in a box anymore. We were 2 people who had seen each other across a crowded room and chosen, consciously or subconsciously, to be trapped together. The distance between our faces had shrunk to nothing, the air charged with the terrifying, beautiful realization that this crash wasn't an accident at all. The confession hung in the air, vibrating. Then, Jax moved. She didn't pull away. Instead, she slid her hand from the back of mine, flipping my palm upward with a dexterity that felt practiced. It was a DJ's move, adjusting the instrument of my own skin. She laced her fingers through mine. The sensation was electric, a sudden, shocking integration of 2 separate systems. Her skin was rougher than mine, the calluses on her fingertips catching against the smooth, lotion-softened skin of my knuckles. It was a contrast that made my breath hitch. I stared at our joined hands. In the amber light, they looked like a sculpture of contradictions. My manicure, perfect and chip-free, against her short, unpolished nails. My pale wrist, fragile and exposed, against the leather cuff of her jacket. It was the architecture of chaos meeting control, rhythm meeting structure. She squeezed, a slow, deliberate pressure that sent a jolt straight up my arm and settled heavy in my chest. The weight of her hand was grounding, a physical anchor in a world that had literally lost its bearings. "So," she murmured, her voice a low rumble in the quiet that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "Here's the $1,000,000 question, Suit. What if they don't come back on?" I looked up, startled, my eyes locking onto hers. "The lights?" "The world," she corrected, leaning in closer until I could see the flecks of gold in her dark irises. "What if the grid is gone for good? What if the doors never open, and this little box is the only reality left? No meetings, no mergers, no schedules to strangle you, just the hum of the battery and the dark." "That's impossible," I whispered, though the protest lacked any real conviction. My thumb instinctively brushed against the side of her hand, seeking the texture of her skin. "Someone will come. The system always resets." "Does it?" she challenged, tilting her head, a lock of hair falling over her eyes. "Or do we just pretend it does so we don't have to deal with the quiet?" She squeezed my hand again, pulling me imperceptibly closer. "Tell me the truth, Eloise. If I told you right now that we had another hour in the dark, just you, me, and the static, would you panic? Or would you be relieved?" The question hung there, dangerous and seductive. My training screamed at me to reject the premise. "Panic," the executive in me insisted. "This is a crisis. Time is money." But the woman sitting on the floor, the one whose hand was currently anchored to a stranger's, felt a treacherous wave of calm wash over her. The burden of the 42nd floor and the endless performance of competence felt 1,000,000 miles away. I started, but the words failed. I looked at her mouth, then back to her eyes. "I wouldn't panic." Jack smiled, and this time it wasn't the bold, teasing grin. It was softer, knowing. "I didn't think so. You like the dark, Eloise. You just don't know what to do with it when you can't organize it." She ran her thumb over the pulse point of my wrist. It was a feather-light touch, barely there, but it felt like a brand. My heart hammered against her skin, betraying every lie I tried to construct. The air in the elevator felt thick, heavy with the scent of her and the heat rising between us. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full. It was crowded with the things we weren't saying and the undeniable weight of our hands locked together. I realized then, with a terrifying clarity, that I wasn't waiting for the rescue team. I wasn't checking my mental watch for the ETA of the maintenance crew. I was dreading the chime. I was dreading the moment the fluorescent lights would buzz back to life and bleach this amber world into clinical reality. I didn't want the doors to open. I didn't want to step back into the lobby, where I was Eloise the executive, the woman of steel and schedules. I wanted to stay here, in the suspended animation, where I was just a woman holding onto a lifeline in the dark. "I don't want to go back yet," I confessed, the words barely a breath, a secret I hadn't even admitted to myself until that second. Jax's gaze darkened. She leaned forward, bridging the last few inches of distance between us. The smell of clove and rain was overwhelming now, drowning out the sterile office air. "Good," she whispered, her voice rough, "because I'm not done with you." The tension didn't just break, it evaporated, replaced by a gravitational pull so strong it felt like the floor had tilted again beneath us. Jax didn't lunge, and she didn't rush. She moved with that terrifying, deliberate slowness she had used to describe her music, the agonizing, delicious buildup before the bass finally drops. She leaned in, and the space between us, which had already been decimated by the darkness and the conversation, simply ceased to exist. The amber light caught the sharp angle of her cheekbone, the dark intent in her eyes. And for the first time in my professional life, I didn't calculate the risk. I didn't forecast the fallout. I just watched her come closer, my breath catching in a throat that had suddenly gone dry. The smell of her was everywhere now. The worn leather, the rain, the faint, sharp tang of clove, filling my lungs, clouding my judgment. It was the scent of everything I kept outside my glass walls, invading the sanctuary. Her gaze dropped to my mouth, heavy and tangible, a physical touch before skin ever met skin. My heart wasn't beating, it was vibrating, a frantic, erratic rhythm that had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with the woman closing the distance. When her lips finally brushed mine, it wasn't the collision I expected. It was a question. Soft. Barely there. A ghost of a touch that sent a shockwave straight down my spine. But the armor was gone. It was piled on the floor next to us, useless wool and silk. I didn't pull back. I couldn't. Instead, I leaned into it. I pressed forward, a millimeter of surrender that answered her question with a desperate affirmative. That was the permission she needed. Jack shifted, the movement fluid and confident. Her hand, the one not laced with mine, left the floor and slid up the column of my neck. Her palm was warm, rough with calluses, a textured reality against my sensitive skin. Her thumb hooked under my jaw, tilting my head back, exposing me completely. It was a gesture of ownership, dominant and assured, and it shattered the last of my composure. The kiss deepened. It wasn't tentative anymore. It was a revelation. Her mouth was hot, demanding, tasting of mint and the dark, quiet intimacy of the shaft. She kissed me with the same focus she must use to control a crowd. Absolute, unwavering, drowning out everything else until she was the only signal left in the noise. I felt a sound vibrate in her throat, a low, pleased hum that resonated in my own chest, blurring the lines between where she ended and I began. My hands, usually so disciplined, so careful not to leave fingerprints, found a mind of their own. My free hand came up to clutch the lapel of her leather jacket, twisting the material, anchoring myself to her as the world spun. The other, still trapped under hers, turned, interlacing our fingers tighter, gripping her like she was the only solid thing in a liquid universe. This was the unraveling. This was the loss of control I had spent a decade fearing. And it didn't feel like a crash. It felt like flying. The executive who lived by 15-minute increments died in that elevator. In her place was just a woman, starving for this friction, for this heat. I opened to her, letting her deepen the contact, letting her tongue trace the seam of my lips, tasting the shock and the want on my tongue. It was messy. It was unscripted. It was the most honest conversation I had ever had. Time dissolved. There was no merger, no board meeting, no 42nd floor. There was only the sensation of her rough thumb stroking my cheek, the heat of her leg against mine, the way her breath hitched when I bit gently at her lower lip. I was drowning in the proximity, in the overwhelming sensory input of her. I realized with a jolt of terrifying clarity that I wasn't just kissing a stranger in a blackout. I was kissing the chaos I had been running from my entire life, and God, it tasted sweet. I wanted to stay here. I wanted the cables to snap. I wanted the world to forget us. I wanted to live in this amber-lit, suspended second forever, where the only thing that mattered was the pressure of her mouth and the way she made me feel like I was finally, terrifyingly, awake. The universe, it seemed, had a cruel sense of timing. The overhead lights didn't flicker this time. They snapped on with an audible crack, flooding the small steel box with a harsh, clinical fluorescence that bleached the shadows and the intimacy right out of the air. The ventilation system roared to life, a sudden, aggressive blast of chilled air that instantly evaporated the heat we had built between us, replacing the sultry atmosphere with the sterile, recycled breath of the corporate machine. We broke apart like we'd been burned. The physical separation was a physical blow, a tearing of skin. I scrambled back, blinking against the sudden glare, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Jax didn't scramble, but she flinched, shielding her eyes with a forearm, the leather jacket creaking in the sudden silence of the human voice. The elevator gave a sickening lurch, the kind that hits you in the stomach, and began to ascend smoothly, as if the last hour of suspended reality had never happened. The hum of the machinery returned, steady and indifferent, erasing the silence we had filled with secrets. I stood up, my legs shaking not from the fatigue of the heels, but from the aftershocks of the kiss. I felt exposed. The amber light had been forgiving. This fluorescent glare was an interrogation lamp. It highlighted the flush on my neck, the slight smudge of mascara, the way my blouse was unbuttoned at the collar. I grabbed my blazer from the floor, shaking off the dust of our confessional, and pulled it on. The movement was frantic, a desperate attempt to reconstruct the armor I had so willingly discarded. I smoothed the wool, buttoned the front, and checked my reflection in the polished steel doors. The woman staring back looked like Eloise the executive, hair smoothed, posture corrected, but her eyes were wild. They were the eyes of someone who had just seen the edge of the map. Jax rose slowly, uncoiling with that feline grace, dusting off her jeans. She didn't try to fix anything. She didn't smooth her hair or adjust her collar. She just looked at me, squinting slightly in the brightness, a small, knowing smile playing on lips that were swollen. "Back to the grid," she said, her voice raspy, cutting through the hum of the fan. It wasn't an apology. It was an acknowledgement of the absurdity of it all. The elevator slowed. The digital display marched upward. 39, 40, 41. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I had a meeting. I had a merger. I had a life that demanded precision. The air in the car still held the ghost of her scent, clove and rain, but it was fading fast, scrubbed away by the aggressive filtration of the building's climate control. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of loss, a grief for a moment that was barely 10 minutes old. Ding! The door slid open with a cheerful, oblivious chime. The sound of the 42nd floor rushed in, the low murmur of phones, the click of typing, the smell of burnt coffee and toner. It was a sensory assault of the mundane. I took a step forward, automatic pilot kicking in, my heels clicking on the threshold. "Hey!" The word was a lasso. I stopped, turning back. Jax was standing in the doorway, blocking the sensor with her shoulder, keeping the world open for just a second longer. She didn't say anything else. She just reached into her pocket and pulled out a thick black Sharpie. She uncapped it with her teeth, the motion casual and devastatingly cool. "Hand," she commanded. I didn't argue. I didn't ask why she didn't just ask for my phone. I extended my hand, palm up, the same hand she had anchored to her knee in the dark. She took it, her grip firm and warm, a final reminder of the heat we were leaving behind. Her fingers were rough, calloused from the turntables, creating a friction against my smooth skin that made me shiver. The felt tip was cold and ticklish as she wrote, the broad strokes bold and dark against my pale palm. She took her time, the tip dragging slowly over the sensitive skin, crossing the 7 with a European flair, making sure the digits were indelible. It felt like a tattoo, a claiming mark in black ink. She capped the pen, sliding it back into her pocket, but she didn't let go of my hand immediately. She squeezed my fingers, her thumb brushing over the pulse point at my wrist one last time. "Finish the conversation," she murmured, her eyes locking onto mine, ignoring the curious glances of a passing paralegal. "I want to hear the rest of the track." She released me, stepping back into the elevator. The doors began to slide shut, slicing her from my view. The leather, the chaos, the smile. And then she was gone. I was left standing in the hallway of the 42nd floor, surrounded by glass and steel, clutching my hand to my chest like a wounded bird, the ink still wet on my skin. I walked into the boardroom, the ink burning against my palm like a secret brand, and for the first time in my career, I didn't open the file or check the clock. I just stared at the messy black digits and smiled. If you would have texted her back before the ink even dried, subscribe and tell me in the comments.